Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'm super happy to have Paul Hayden here with us. As some of you may know, I'll be performing his wonderful concerto for alto saxophone and orchestra with the Sonoma County Philharmonic coming up here in January. We're doing two performances of it in the Jackson Theater here in Santa Rosa. So very excited to have Paul with us and to talk about this piece. I personally had never heard it before our conductor, Norman Gamboa, suggested it, and I've really fell in love with the work. So I wanted to have Paul sort of talk about it, and hopefully more saxophonists will be very interested in performing this just stunning work. So Paul, thank you so much for being here. I guess my first question for you is, tell me about yourself. Tell everybody about your background, some of the music that you've been writing, your influences. We'd love to know more about you.
Great. Well, it's great to talk with you, Andrew. I was delighted that you're playing the piece. I'm really looking forward to your performance. Um, so very quickly, I grew up in South Louisiana and actually got my bachelor's degree at LSU. Went up to University of Illinois and studied with Ben Johnston and Salvatore Martirano composition there. Um, Came back to Louisiana, taught for a while, went back to Illinois and taught for a while. My girlfriend at that time got over a serious illness and said, this long distance crap has got to stop. So I quit my job and moved down to Baton Rouge, and I've been just a freelance composer ever since. And I've written a lot of saxophone music, probably maybe the two best known pieces there's a piece for flute and saxophone called Janus,
Mhm.
which played and recorded quite a bit, and there's another piece called a concerto for alto saxophone and piano Latin steps, and that's been played and recorded quite a bit. Most of my saxophone music was recorded by Griff Campbell, who is currently at LSU. He's getting ready to retire pretty soon. So I've written a lot of saxophone. I really love the saxophone. Everybody tends to know of it as a loud technical instrument that can cut through a lot of textures and
Oh,
play fast notes. But it's really a beautiful instrument when it's in the right hands. And that's one of the things that I tried to do in this concerto is emphasize the beauty of the sound as well as technical. I mean, there's some really technical things in this concerto, but there are also places where you can really shine and show off the beauty of your sound. So that's kind of my background in a nutshell, and my love of the saxophone goes back a long time.
what was your first experience writing for saxophone?
Let's see, that was probably Latin steps. I know that I wrote that piece for alto saxophone and piano, and I showed it to Frank Wicks, who was the band director at LSU at that time, and he said, "Well, you need to retitle it Concerto for Alto Saxophone and make a band arrangement." And I said, "What? What are you talking about? I didn't conceive of this for band." And he said, "Yep, you need to retitle it and arrange it for band." I said, "Okay." So I arranged it for band, and Carl Fischer loved it, and they published both versions. Now I'm publishing the piano version of Latin Steps, and they have on rental the band version.
Mhm.
And so that was probably my first piece that I wrote for saxophone. And Griff Campbell here at LSU, he premiered it and recorded it.
Okay.
And after that, I just kind of fell in love with the saxophone. And I mean, like violinist and clarinetist and flutist, I mean, they're all spoiled because they have this gigantic repertoire. And I mean, violinists, most of them are not interested in concerto from you. You know, they don't want that. I mean, they have this great repertoire, but saxophonists are interested in new repertoire. And so I like the fact that they were open to new pieces. And I've also written pieces like Janus for flute and alto saxophone and Air for flute and alto saxophone. And they both use extended techniques, multiphonics,
Mhm.
things like that. Now, this concerto that you're playing, Concerto for Alto Saxophone and Orchestra, has no extended techniques in it. It just has some flutter tonguing.
Yeah.
But that's how I kind of fell in love with the saxophone, and I've written quite a few pieces for it.
Yeah, I really agree with you on kind of the what the saxophone is capable of doing, especially today. We focus very heavily on the technique of saxophone, the extended techniques especially get a lot of attention. But for me, my connection with the saxophone always been how vocal it is and how it can sound like the human voice in the right
Yeah.
context, and how it gets the range of color that I think string instruments can that tap into all the time. When you listen to great violinists, they're constantly shading their tone and have such a wide variety of dynamics and articulations and colors. And I think saxophone is really able to keep up with them on that. But oftentimes it's not tapped into because you can't do that with multiphonics. You can't do that with flutter tongues. It's just a noise.
Yeah.
So that's what I really love about this piece. I can actually play with those nuances of color because of just how the work sort of plays out. So
Yeah.
I think you're right on with that.
Yeah, that's what I tried to do at the very beginning when the saxophone first comes in my concerto, is just have beauty of tone.
Mhm.
And that the first movement, the slow sections have some technical stuff in it, but most of it just has to do with playing lyrically and showing off the tone. The middle section, of course, has some really difficult licks in it, as you well know.
Yeah.
But the outer sections are more lyrical.
Mhm. So tell us how did this piece kind of come about? So you mentioned it to me previously, but when was the commission? What was the goal with this work, and how it came to be?
So uh, I was starting to get interested in writing for orchestra in the early 2000s. I was uh, not a real young pro. I was in my 40s, my young 40s. I had written an orchestral piece when I was in my 20s, and I was not satisfied with it. So I started this orchestral piece early 2000s, and I realized it wasn't working out. I liked some of the ideas, but it just didn't work for orchestra. And I thought, I think that this could work for maybe clarinet or alto saxophone. And so I settled on alto sax. And over the next few years, it morphed into this saxophone concerto. And I listened to a bunch of saxophone concertos by a lot of composers, and I heard some really good pieces, but I didn't hear anything that really struck me stylistically.
Mhm.
It seemed like there was a lot of technique, there was a lot of neoclassical stuff, there was some really hardcore modernist pieces, very dissonant and angular. Uh, Nothing that really hit me. And then, oddly enough, I heard a piece by Peter Lieberson. Well, I didn't know a lot of his music at the time, but I heard his wife sing his Neruda songs with the Boston Symphony in 2005. And I love that piece. It really struck me stylistically. I thought it was very beautiful. And I, um, I decided to uh, include a little homage to Lieberson in the first movement of my piece, in the transition between the A section and the faster B section. There's a little transition where I kind of have a variation of just a little 30-second uh, transitory piece in his piece Drala. I think that's how you pronounce it, which he wrote back in the 80s. It's a really beautiful um, uh, short section. So I created a variation on that. And that was kind of my homage to Lieberson, because I thought that was so beautiful. So some of the concertos I heard, especially like the E Bearer, I think is a great piece. It's an old piece. I mean, it's back in the 30s.
Mhm.
But like I said, I didn't hear anything stylistically that really struck me. So this saxophone concerto really came out of that abandoned orchestral piece. And then, of course, you have to try to find somebody, an orchestra that will play it,
Right.
because there's not a whole lot of saxophone concertos that are being played by orchestras. It's getting to be a little bit better now in the past 5-10 years,
Yeah.
but not at that time. So it was chosen to be premiered by NASA, North American Saxophone Alliance, at their national conference in Athens, Georgia, in 2010. And I went out there to hear Griff play it, and they did a great job, and I was really happy with the piece. So that's kind of the genesis of the piece.
Did you work with Griff while you were writing it? Was there anything about his playing or his sort of ideals as a player that made its way into the work?
Yeah, because I knew that he had a beautiful tone
Mm-hmm.
as well as technique. And I thought, a lot of these concertos that I heard, it was all technique, 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 fingers, fingers, fingers. And I thought, I'd really like to show off the beauty of his tone. So that's how the slow sections of this concerto came about. And then I had to work with him closely on the technical stuff. As you know, from months and months and months of woodshedding some technical stuff, especially in the middle of the first movement, there's some really tough licks in there.
Yep.
And so I had to talk with Griff about that. And he said, you might want to write an ossia for this just in case somebody likes a piece but just can't play those sections. So I did. And then the second movement, of course, is a little bit more technical as far as notes go. But yeah, I did. I had to work with Griff. As a matter of fact, I did that on that piece I mentioned earlier, Latin Steps,
Mm-hmm.
for saxophone and piano and saxophone and band. There was just a really, really hard lick in there. I mean, very awkward for the fingers. And I said, look, rather than try to spend countless hours on this one measure, let me see if I can just rewrite this so that I'm happy with it. And it's not so horrible to play, because
Mm-hmm.
something just horrible for the fingers. And so I rewrote it. And so that was a good experience in learning that it's better to rewrite something so that it isn't just bitching hard. It still sounds good. There's no
Yeah.
reason to have 99% of the musicians out there butchering a measure when you can rewrite it.
It's interesting because, with saxophone, technique-wise, there's not a lot we can't do. And you sort of found our limit in, it sounds like, two pieces now, which is really interesting. The lick in this concerto, like you mentioned, I've been working at it for a long time, and it is awkward, but we do a lot of awkward stuff. So it's kind of interesting that you managed to find our sort of our kryptonite a little bit.
Yeah, and when musicians can play it, it sounds good.
Yeah.
That's what I like. It really sounds good.
So let's talk about the two movements a little bit. In the program notes, you talk about the first movement being sort of an homage to what happened in Katrina, and then the second movement is a Passacaglia. Can you talk about sort of what you were thinking with those two forms and how that came about?
Yeah, so Katrina was a big deal here in 2006. It was a gigantic catastrophe for a beautiful city. I mean, it's kind of the anchor of Louisiana. And I just felt so sorry for the people of New Orleans having to go through this horrific experience. And, just kind of for myself, I wanted to write something that just let people know that somebody was thinking about their pain. So I decided to write this lullaby, a berceuse, for New Orleans. And so the beginning of it kind of has this gentle rocking sound with a beautiful sound in the saxophone, and progresses from there to a more active middle section with all the difficult licks, and then comes back to the opening at the end of the first movement. And that was one of a couple of pieces that I wrote as kind of my reaction to the Katrina disaster. There was a piece I wrote, the Farrell Vernon Commission for sopranino saxophone and piano. You can believe that. It's the only time I've ever written for sopranino saxophone. Yeah. That piece is called Das Echo von New Orleans. And that was kind of another reaction to the Katrina catastrophe. So that's how the first movement came about.
And is there anything particular about the Passacaglia, the second movement, that is noteworthy?
I've always really enjoyed working with forms like Passacaglia and Chaconne. Last night, the LSU Wind Ensemble premiered a new band piece of mine. Mm-hmm. And the second movement is a Chaconne. So this idea of repeating bass line, like in the Passacaglia of this concerto, and the Chaconne last night, which is just repeating chord progression in the band piece, I've always found fascinating. So it sounds a little bit jazzy, and that starts off with a solo plucked double bass, and then that bass line comes back in various forms throughout the entire movement. And then there's all this stuff that's going on above it. There's several variations above the bass line. The bass line goes through various transformations. So that's how that came about. And okay. So, yeah, but that was very enjoyable for me to work on with that Passacaglia.
Yeah, it's a fun theme and variations, and it's quite technical, but it sort of has a lyricism to it as well. I'm glad you said that comment about it being a little jazzy, because that's how I felt it. It's nice to have that confirmed. As I've been diving into the piece, doing my score study, listening to the recordings that you sent me, one of the things I really like about the work is, even though the saxophone's the soloist, there's a lot of really cool orchestral solos in there as well. Like there's a lot of like interesting flute saxophone duos and flute harp interactions. I think harp really has like a big focus in the work. Is there anything there that between like saxophone sort of talking between these other instruments? So I sort of noticed that flute and harp and a few others kind of popped up a lot with their own little solos.
Yeah, well, the harp came in from my need at the very beginning of the piece. There's strings very gently playing this cluster chord, this descending scale, which turns into a cluster, and the harp, and I think it's celeste, or is it glockenspiel? It's one of those. So I really wanted to use the harp. Harp is used in various places in the first movement, slow movement, but it's also used in the fast movement as well. Mm-hmm. There are places where I thought it provided a great color. Of course, it's easy for the harp to get lost if you do anything that's loud at all. I mean, all you can do is, glissandos and, stuff like that. Otherwise, it's never going to be heard. Right. So I had to, in places in the second movement where the texture thins out, I do use it. And I really love the sound of it. I think it adds quite a bit.
Yeah, especially in the first movement, I feel that the harp, like you were describing that opening section with the descending strings, and it's this very like dark, clustery, blended sound, and then you have these really bright harp sounds that are sort of coming on top of it, and it really paints a beautiful picture, and the saxophone just sort of enters in the middle of that. And I really enjoyed that opening. And that's something I think probably the thing that speaks to me the most with this piece is just how colorful it is. Like you've spoken a lot about the lyricism, but it's sort of the different sounds and textures sort of morph throughout the entire work. The first movement really slowly, like the way you enter and transition into the faster section and then come out of it, it's very subtle. And then in the second movement, it's very clear cut because it's a theme and variation. So you can kind of hear where all those variations begin. But the way the piece sort of unfolds and all those colors are sprinkled in, I found it to be very compelling. It's almost like painting a picture rather than sort of soloist plus accompaniment.
Yes. Well, right after that opening section with the harp that we were talking about, there's a great big duo between you and the flute. There's big flute solo there. Probably because my wife is a flutist, so
I'll
and
do
I
it.
and that was my main instrument was flute. So
Okay.
I'm very partial. So the flute it comes in as very high, and then you tend to be rather low. So there's a dialogue going on there between
Mhm.
the flute and saxophone. Um, and then after that is where we get to the transition, which was kind of my little homage to Peter Lieberson. And then you get into the faster section, um, which has again those descending scales in the strings. It's very colorful. There's a lot of stuff going on in the percussion, and then you have all of your horrific licks.
Yeah, those are tricky for sure.
Yeah.
I'm just curious, with you have those scalar patterns happening underneath. How did you come up with that super angular stuff for the saxophone? Like what made you think of that?
Um, well, the those scales in the faster middle section are just taken directly from the beginning of the piece,
Mhm,
and then I add a bunch of color around that with percussion and
mhm,
the woodwinds playing kind of tremolos and stuff, and and then the saxophone is kind of playing off of that cluster. It's playing as a response to that cluster, and it starts off not so bad. You have some triplets and scale-wise things, and then you get into the real,
the
the
end of it.
really tough stuff. Yeah, and I don't remember exactly how I came about um, composing those really tough passages. I know it had something to do with the underlying um, chords that were going on there that provide the background.
Mhm,
And I'm sure that this is simply playing off of that.
sure.
So I do apologize
You don't have
for
to.
that. um, and then those, at least when you learn those licks, you get to play them again in the cadenza in the second movement.
Yes, that's true. Um, I want to ask one more question about the use of the altissimo register in this piece. There's not a lot of extended technique in it, a little bit of flutter tonguing in the second movement, but altissimo is very prevalent throughout this whole work. But you use it. A lot of composers will like have us really be virtuosic up there, which is not always a good idea because it's hard to voice those notes very quickly sometimes, but you make have us do it very slowly and very lyrically. Did you feel that? I've always felt that altissimo has like a pretty drastic timbral change. We try to make sure that it doesn't, but it's really hard to force it to sound like the rest of the saxophone. Did that have any influence when you were writing this? Because it feels like when I go into the altissimo register, it's kind of like the way you use harp sometimes. It's this texture that sort of sticks out from the rest rather than trying to work the altissimo register into the ensemble, which is significantly harder.
Yeah, you have to be really careful in dealing with the altissimo register. I just heard re-listen to Bochum's concert suite
Mhm.
for alto sax and band. And that's got a bunch of altissimo stuff in
Yeah,
it. It's
a lot.
that's really hard piece. Um, and unless you have somebody that kind of specializes in getting around an altissimo register, that's a disaster waiting to happen. Uh, I kind of feel like you have to be really careful about that. I was just looking at the end of the cadenza here. I see it's high D, C, C sharp, I think, written pitches.
Yeah.
Um, and, I mean, I've heard a bunch of concertos I mean, that just scream up there. I mean, I think I heard a piece by Harrison Birtwistle Panic, I think. Um, it's a modernist piece and tons of altissimo stuff in it.
Mhm.
So, but I try to be really careful by that because I learned my lesson about, fingerings. I mean, it's the same way on the flute. If you're going to do really technical stuff in the highest octave, you're asking for trouble.
Mhm.
It's fine if you have, you know, one of the world's great flutists playing your piece. Sure, you can write anything you want, but what about the other 99% of the players out there who are really good players, but don't specialize in third octave stuff?
Yeah.
So, yeah, I try to be careful about writing in the altissimo register, but I tend to use it more for dramatic places because doing pianissimo on high C sharps. I mean, that's probably not the best idea.
Yeah, I think you use it well, and I think it serves the purpose that you're speaking to right now. Yeah, I agree. A lot of, I have to do that stuff all the time, and sometimes it just feels like composers will write altissimo like their normal notes, and it's not always about the technique of it. That's certainly difficult, but for me, it comes down to timbre. I try really hard to make altissimo sound like the normal notes on the saxophone, and it's sort of an impossible task, but we try to do it anyway. And
Yeah, it sounds like
that's that
screaming sometimes.
yeah, so that's where I really like this piece. You're as we go higher and the way the texture sort of changes underneath the saxophone, it lends itself to that color change versus just sort of playing them in ignorance like they're not different when they really are.
Oh yeah, yeah. No, I tried to be careful about altissimo register, and I think it can be very effective. But um, I remember I heard Griff Campbell playing an arrangement of something, just a traditional piece, and probably a violin and piano piece or something. And he was playing it at actual pitch
Mhm.
up in the altissimo. It's like lyrical stuff. And I was thinking, Griff, you might want to rethink this. It's just it's like, okay, you showed us that you can do it, but you might want to bring it down an octave in order to make it musical.
I recently did the entire Rachmaninoff cello sonata with my piano duo, and I played it on alto, which is already probably the wrong move, but it actually works pretty well on alto, even though it's an octave higher. But yeah, there
Uh,
was those moments where I can play the altissimo, that's not the issue, but does it sound right?
right, right.
And I think you handled that question very nicely in this piece.
Yeah, I have a friend that is a bassoonist, and he arranged the Prokofiev flute sonata for bassoon and piano. And it's, I mean, I I really admire the fact that you can play it. I mean, it's a really hard piece, but doing it on bassoon, even down an octave or two, is I I don't know. I didn't think it worked very well.
Yeah, it's been done on soprano saxophone, and those screaming high notes, they're
Yeah.
the recordings I've heard, they're in tune. It still doesn't make it sound good. Anyway, um, I think that's all the questions I had about the piece. I've really like come to adore this one, and I hope to get to play it again after this first performance. Is there anything else that you want to add to this conversation? Anything about the piece that you'd love the audience to know?
Um, Not really. Just that one of the reasons why I was really taken with Peter Lieberson's Neruda songs is because he approached tonality kind of the same way I do, which is in a very roundabout way, not doing things that are just very predictable as far as harmonic progression and stuff like that. I really don't have any interest in that.
Mhm.
And I'm not interested in doing atonal stuff either, except maybe for short sections.
Mhm.
But this piece, like the beginning, uses some minor scales, like kind of G minorish, and the middle section is sort of B minorish, but there's no real attempt to strongly establish those or do any kind of traditional progressions. It's the
Mhm.
same way in the second movement in that I use some major scales, F major, B flat major, D flat major, but uh, I really enjoy being able to create sonorities that maybe sound somewhat familiar,
Mhm.
but you're not quite sure where they've come from or where they're going. And I like that ambiguity. Um, uh, I just listened recently to Michael Torke's concerto for soprano sax and
Mhm.
orchestra. He kind of does something that's even simpler. It's kind of pandiatonic, which is where, Stravinsky used to do this. You take a C major scale, but you don't really do much to emphasize C.
Right.
You can emphasize any note in that scale, but it kind of sounds sort of tonalish.
Mhm.
And in this piece, it's fairly chromatic in places, but I really enjoy alluding to tonality. In case you're curious, it ends on an F9 chord in first inversion. So
Mhm.
I love the sonority. So
Yeah, and I think that that's maybe what opens it up to being such a sort of, in my mind, maybe this is the wrong analogy, but it's sort of like an impressionist painting. It's not really telling us what it is, but you can kind of sort of see a picture within it. And
mhm,
maybe that's where that comes from, that
mhm.
ambiguity that you're talking about. So
Yeah, yeah, I think
yeah.
that's a good analogy, because throughout my entire career, I've sort of been interested in really um, trying to make music that is neither extremely atonal nor extremely straightforward tonal, but somewhere that can use both dissonance and consonance
Mhm.
in an evocative way. And I guess that's why most of the composers that I admire, even some modernist composers, are very sensitive about using consonance and dissonance. Because for me, at least, that's the most expressive way to write music.
Yeah, well, I think with this one, it really comes across because I've done quite a few concertos now, and this one really is just, it's just fun to play with, to explore all the different sounds and colors. I'm very into changing my vibrato and evolving it over the course of a piece, or like being very flexible with things like articulation and dynamics. And this really allows me to flex those muscles. There's no right way to do it. You can really do what you want to do with this piece.
Yeah, yeah. Um, well, I'm really thrilled that you're going to perform it, and I can't wait to hear your version of it. And
Yeah, I'm very excited too. And for those of you who are in the area and are interested in checking out the performance, it'll be with the Sonoma County Philharmonic, and tickets are on sale right now on their website, socophil.org. So there's two performances of it over the weekend. So we're really excited about it. Paul, thank you so much for taking the time and for writing this wonderful piece. I really hope that more saxophonists find it and perform it, because it really is a very special concerto.
well, thank you so much, Andrew. I really appreciate that, and I'm looking forward to hearing your performance.